Hello, Patreons. We are back again with the Spotlight, our Patreon segment where we get to talk to creatives and creators. And I've got a great gentleman here with me tonight, Marvel Comics legend, of which I've had the privilege of talking to a great number of. But this is Danny Fingeroth, a very big Marvel guy from days gone by. Danny, how are you this evening?
Okay, I'm well. Days gone by. Well, that's an interesting. I like to think my days are still here, but I know it.
Yes, sir. Absolutely. Well, I think about it because I grew up, and I'll get into talking a little bit more about that. But I grew up reading Marvel comics in the 1980s. My first comic was in 1982. I was 6, and that was a licensed comic. So I read Star Wars, then Indiana Jones, and then when I was 10, I discovered Spider-Man, which is kind of where you came in.
Right.
But before we get to all that, tell me about how you got started in the business. How did you become a Marvel Comics editor and writer?
Well, I am from the first. A lot of people my age, a lot of people born within a year or two of me, worked at Marvel when I was there. Prime, mid baby boom generation, because we were the perfect age when those first Marvels, Fantastic Four, Amazing Spider-Man, the beginnings of Iron Man, Daredevil, Thor. We were the perfect age, because at least in my case, and I think true with a lot of my peers, we've been reading comics. We loved comics. We understood how to read a comic book, which if you don't learn when you're a little kid, you may not ever, no matter how intelligent you are. So we were reading comics from an early age, and without knowing it, at least in my case, I was kind of jaded or right. I've been reading, DC and Harvey and even some Marvel, without because they weren't really branded then. If you go to I remember my barber shop for some reason had Millie the Model comics. I think probably somebody would be giving away comics, and probably no offense to the Millie fans or Millie, but probably that would be the most likely one a kid would give away if his mother was saying, "Get rid of these comics, give them to the barber shop." But Millie was written and drawn by the same people. Anyway, so I've been reading 3 4 years. Been reading a whole lot of comics. I love superheroes. And then a classmate of mine told me there was this new thing called the Fantastic Four. He thought I would like it, and so I picked up Fantastic Four #4 with the Submariner, Return of the Submariner, at my local candy store, which was also a magazine store, and that was the beginning of my relationship with the characters and the creators. And it was just as that whole juggernaut of Stan Lee bonding with the audience, starting with the cover copy, going through to the stories, of course, but the captions, the footnotes, the letters pages, the special, everything was designed to for the right person. I mean, I knew there were people who that didn't appeal to, but it was designed. It was the voice of an adult who understood why you love these things. He didn't talk down to you like you were an idiot, but he also didn't pretend that he was a kid. It was just like a sympathetic, funny adult who happened to be the guy who was also co-creating the stories. And so I had this deep bond with Marvel, with comics in general, Marvel especially. Um, and as you may know, I wrote many years later. I wrote Stan Lee's biography. What many
And
people.
that was actually my second question.
Anyway,
So you're gonna go right into that. That's perfect.
those are much longer. So that's and then like many people, I was not a lifelong comic reader. I stopped when I was a lifelong comic reader, but I kind of shifted over towards underground and independent stuff and American Splendor and Mouse
Yeah.
um, and I was a film major in college, the same school where Art Spiegelman went several years earlier. And I had one of his most influential teachers, a guy named Ken Jacobs, who's also my teacher. And Art in the 70s came up there and lectured. So I'd always been interested in the combination of words and pictures. And at a certain point, I quote unquote outgrew superhero comics. And then I graduated with a degree in film, came back but to my hometown, as one does. My hometown was the Upper East Side of Manhattan. So it was a little different, So then I thought, well, what am I going to do? I'm not really interested in moving to Hollywood. Even though I had a film degree, it was sort of more of a fine arts kind of film program. But even so, I thought, well, I need to do something. Don't really want to go to graduate school. Um, Wonder it might be fun to work at Marvel Comics for a while I'm deciding what I want to do with my life. And of course, interestingly, I never said to myself, "It might be fun to work at DC Comics." I said, and I had like a tangential contact. I had somebody could get me in the door there, but didn't really know anybody. Just could get me in the door. And so I went on an informational visit there, and that ended up. I ran into a guy I went to high school with who was working there, and through him, I ended up getting my first job in comics, which was as Larry Lieber's assistant. Larry
No,
is Stan Lee's brother. Larry had
right.
come back from Atlas Seaboard and was running what was called the British department. But we put out mostly reprint material and some new material, but repackaged the American comics for a British audience because the British audience, especially among children, was weekly black and white comics with multiple stories.
Oh, okay.
That gave me a
Wow.
great opportunity to read stuff I'd missed in all those years I wasn't reading the comics, then break them down to chapters. So I learned story structure, and then worked with artists to do new covers, new splash pages. And we did Captain Britain, and so that was my first job in comics. And really, there was a while when I wasn't sure, if I'd stick with it. I enjoyed it. I met a lot of talented, funny, very smart, nice people. I remember that everybody was nice to me on that initial informational interview, but the person I remember most being most welcoming, and sort of just what you'd want a childhood idol to be, was John Romita Sr.
Oh, wow.
He was
God,
he was
the
working
legend.
he was working in the office, and I mean, turned out he was that way with almost everybody, because there was, you know, I sort of poked my head in a bunch of offices. I was with an intern was showing me around. And, I could, if not literally, metaphorically, I could hear my resumes hitting their garbage cans as I left the room.
Oh, no.
Just sort of, and, well, I mean, then my resume was about 3 lines long, so, but John really took time just to, and I'm sure I asked a bunch of dopey, ignorant fanboy type questions, but he was very, anyway, so about 6 months later, I ended up getting that job working, and again coming full circle. Something I'm very involved now. Larry is 93 and has just written his first prose novel.
Wow.
And
At
that's a
93.
novel. Hold on. Let me grab a copy. It's called Chirps,
Wow.
and it's all look. It's all words. And Larry,
Whoa.
for a
No
number,
pictures.
for a
Holy
number,
cow.
it is a novel. It's an action adventure novel, and
Wow.
Larry, for a number of reasons, we didn't want to go the traditional publishing route, so we self-published it. Although it's got the name of Concourse Publishing, if you can,
Mhm.
yeah.
Oop,
Well, anyway,
got
so
it.
actually, that's one of the things I'm doing at that convention this weekend is helping Larry promote the book because he's already working on another novel.
That's
So it's
fantastic at
pretty
93.
inspirational,
That's
and it's
amazing.
full circle.
Wow. God, crazy. So, moving from Larry to back to talking about Stan,
Sure.
you had mentioned obviously that you had done his biography. And it was published after his passing because it came out in 2019. I believe he passed at the end of 2018, if I'm not
Right.
mistaken.
Yeah, he did exactly.
So tell me about that experience. What was it like? I mean, you knew him. You weren't just going in cold. You knew him. You'd worked with him. Had some experience. What was it like?
Well, let me fill in a few gaps between 1977 and 2019.
By all means, by all means.
So it turned out I did, working at Marvel was a good fit, and so I ended up moving through the ranks there and, coming out of the British department into the mainstream editorial where I worked as Louise Jones, now Louise Simonson's assistant. And
Wow. Yeah.
I was doing a bunch of writing. I was writing The Dazzler. Yes, I've written more Dazzler than any human on the living or dead. Uh,
I was actually picked up an issue of Dazzler. I have Marvel, the Marvel Unlimited app, which is
right, right,
easier to read. So I was having a conversation with Dazzler with my friend Kurt, who was the one who introduced us. So I read an issue of it yesterday.
right. Well, it was, look, it was a strange time and it was a weird comic to start my comic writing uh, career on, but I did and paid my rent. Because these staff salaries were low, so really the only way to make a decent living was to do freelance, and I'd always been a writer. Um, so Dazzle, then I ended up. I mean, I'm giving you the real Reader's Digest. Ended up being promoted to be the editor of the Spider-Man titles.
Right,
I
exactly.
worked with Louise on X-Men and everything else. X-Men, Conan, Man Thing, Dazzler. Was moved from there to the Spider-Man titles. Um, Spent a number of years as a contract freelancer. Came back in '89, getting the Spidey titles back, and then that was in the big boom. So suddenly, Spider-Man wasn't just 3 or 4 monthly titles; it was like 18 or 19 monthly titles. Plus,
Right.
I was writing Dark Hawk, Deadly Foes of Spider-Man, um, and through that period, I worked with Stan to a certain degree. There was some one of the most surreal experiences of my career was the 1984 Amazing Spider-Man Annual, which Tom DeFalco plotted and Ron Frenz drew, but Stan scripted. Stan did all the dialogue, sound effects, and really made it his own. But it was
84.
very weird.
I'm trying to remember the
Scor-
book that was.
Scorpion Takes a Bride, but it's J.J.
That's yeah, there you go. Yeah, JJ's wedding number 2. Marla Madison was her name?
Yeah, Marla Mad.
Yeah. Now I remember. I can see the cover in
Yeah,
my
it
head.
was Ron Frenz and Bob Layton did it, and it was so I hadn't knew Stan because of course he'd come in and chat with Larry sometimes, and he was until 1980. Stan came into the office every day. 1980, he moved to California pretty much full time, and so I knew him, but I didn't know him. I never, I knew him because he was Stan, and I knew him from my impression of him as a kid, and from just reading the books. So I edited that, and then over the years, I worked with him. I edited some scripts of his. Um, Went to his house once when Jim Shooter brought all the editors out to the San Diego Con in '83. But I was by no means, close with him. I knew him the way, Stan was nice to everybody, witty, bantery. In then for better or worse, I'm the editor that greenlit the Clone Saga. Came up with the idea for Maximum, what later became
Yeah.
Maximum Carnage.
Yeah.
It was the year of the big event, and
Yeah.
uh, and I was behind or somehow involved with anything that was Spider-Man. There was a big corporate restructuring in the mid '90s. Things overnight became ugly, and I left to go work for a guy named Byron Price. I didn't get fired. My joke was, I didn't get laid off. I just was jealous of those people who did. But it was just a classic. If you ever worked in a corporation and you've ever had
Oh
the
god, yes.
experience of having a restructuring thing, people were brought in as consultants whose expertise was selling soap. Like this guy worked at Procter and Gamble, so of course he'll be great at helping sell comics.
Oh my gosh.
Because what could be the difference between comics and soap? So then everywhere I went after that, I was the guy who knew Stan Lee. I went to work for Byron Price, and Byron was friend. If you knew that name, Byron was a packager and publisher. You may not know his name, Priss. You may not
Mhm,
know his
mhm.
name, but I bet you have books that he packaged or published on your bookshelf at home. He had
Probably
a
so.
wide array of stuff, worked with everybody. Through him, I met Will Eisner. Through him, I got to know
Wow.
Stan better. He knew and was friends with Harvey Kurtzman. Byron was a very interesting guy. He was unfortunately died in a car accident about 15 years ago, but he's like one of the unsung heroes of comics. It's funny. It's a guy who did a lot, and was controversial in his way, but was very innovative. Anyway, so at Byron's, even though Byron knew Stan, Stu Byron, everything I went after Marvel, I was the guy who knew Stan, and so I did get to know Stan. And then even before that, he and I bonded because at the time I was feeling marginalized at Marvel in my last months there. They were sort of marginalizing him too. You know, they were just, the new corporate overlords were kind of going, well, why are we paying this guy all this money? And so he was, you know, everybody thinks of Stan, well, of course, he's always been Marvel and he's the mascot and the voice and
Right.
the cameos, but there are different periods, you know. Stan and Joan, his late wife, they had many high powered lawyers working on their behalf, protecting, as they should have, the Stan Lee
Mhm.
position and legacy. So over the years, and again, so I got to know Stan. At a certain point, I was working for Wizard World, the convention chain,
Oh, yeah.
and I became Stan's regular moderator. So it was all these things where I knew him but didn't know him. I certainly, you know, Stan was great at returning email. He didn't like to have email hanging over his head. So if he was somebody he knew at all, he would. So I would say I got to know him, but not in a close personal circle way. I mean, and yet because, I'd done a book before that with Roy Thomas for Tomorrow's Publishing called The Stanley Universe.
Mhm.
For that, I took a trip to Stan's archives, which are at the University of Wyoming in Laramie.
Oh my goodness. How did they get there?
You know, there was a period when nobody in any of the big universities in New York or LA was interested in comics. And, and so there was some people in Wyoming. I mean, who decided it's a great popular culture archive. I mean, it's got archives by a long list of like Academy Award winning screenwriters and directors who are not household names, right?
Yeah.
So they don't have Alfred Hitchcock, but they have Barbara Stanwyck, and they have, like I said, people who, if you're a big film fan,
Yeah.
and then you might know. But they have this, and they decided at some point they would specialize in comic book editors, and so Stan was the natural one. I think now, Karen Green at Columbia and other people at other universities are more proactive. But when Stan started giving looking for a place for his archives, there wasn't. I don't think there was a whole. I don't. You know, I think they were aggressive in searching him out. Excuse me. So I went. So I went out. So to do this book with Roy called the Stanley Universe. You can still get that from Tomorrow, certainly digitally, if not. And
Mhm.
that I went out there because I tried to order through their online finding aid and it was useless. I could see they didn't know what they had. So I went out there and I spent a week there. And so through that, I was able to do a lot of, and I found just incredible stuff. At this point, there's probably over 200 boxes of Stan's archives there.
Oh
I
my
think when I went, there
gosh.
were only 100, but and that archives includes video and audio stuff from like the 40s, 50s, 60s
Oh,
of all these
jeez.
different appearances. So, so I found a lot of great stuff there, and then I did get to know Stan, more through these various interviews, and I interviewed him for my Right Now magazine for Tomorrow's, and there was a project I worked for a company called Visionary Media, and which is an animation company, and we did stuff with Stan. So just somehow I got to know him, and then I started writing books about 20 years ago. Superman on the Couch was really my first book about comics. Its full title, Superman on the Couch: What Superheroes Really Tell Us About Ourselves and Our Society.
Oh yeah.
And Stan wrote the introduction. Will Eisner, who hated superheroes, gave me a blurb because I got to know Will. One of the things I do is I run something called Will Eisner Week for the Will Eisner, Will's heirs, the Will Eisner Studio. Anyway, so started writing books. I wrote that. I wrote a book called Disguised as Clark Kent: Jews, Comics, and the Creation of the Superhero. And and somehow got in my friends in publishing, in non-comics publishing, said, maybe you can do a biography of Stan. I said that would be great. Um, and at that point, I tried to get him to do an authorized one, and he was tempted. You know, um, but I think he ultimately, for whatever reason, if you one thing you find in Stan's archives is a contract that he had signed with Simon and Schuster to write his autobiography, and then
Mhm.
you find the correspondence with Stan returning the advance
No.
because he wasn't able to write his there. But there were there were notes he made, elaborate notes, and I don't know if I'd seen them at that point, but in the years since I've seen them,
Yeah.
and they were fine. You know, I'm sure whatever for whatever reason he couldn't bring himself. So, so I just kept hounding him. And I remember he said to me one day, "Danny, if I wanted anybody to do it, it would be you, but I don't want to do it." Uh,
Flattering, very
yeah,
flattering.
well, look, maybe I was the 10th guy he said that to that week. Who the hell knows,
Could
right?
be, right. This is a
Um,
stock line, right.
but eventually, I think, so I would revisit it every few months. And one time he said to me, "I don't want to do it. You know, why don't you do a Kitty Kelly?" Which I don't think Kitty Kelly wrote a very controversial biography of Frank Sinatra.
Oh.
And Sinatra sued her, and I think he lost because everything in it was proven. It was unflattering.
Right.
So I don't
Didn't
think
make it
Stan
natural,
really
right.
literally meant do a Kitty Kelly, but he meant do an unauthorized biography. And by that point, since I'd written the other books, I had an agent, and he was able to get me a pretty good deal at St. Martin's Press to write the book. And then I called I called Stan or either emailed or called Stan or called him, and he said, "Oh, congratulations! Hope it goes well. I'm not going to tell people to talk to you or not talk to you, but I don't have any. I'm not doing any interviews. I have no time." Needless to say, I did two very lengthy interviews with Stan for the biography,
Found the time.
and I don't. Look, he did a lot of interviews, so I can't say they were the last ones, but I think they were among the last ones. And he had all his marbles. Which he always did. I mean, I saw Stan somewhat close to the end, and even though he was physically very weak, I never had the sense that he had lost his ability to understand and respond to questions and give detailed and accurate answers, or as accurate as he would allow himself to get. So what I say about the book, and I think it's true, is I was friendly with Stan. I was his colleague. I was an admirer, but I was not in his inner circle. I was somebody, um, and so I feel like I believe the book is not a hagiography. I think it's pretty frank. What I don't do that other biographers tend to do is when you're writing a book, right? Here's the big thing with Stan Lee, right? If you can write a book, oh no, that guy who everybody thought was so great and nice, and so adorable, like in his cameos. Well, guess what? That guy was really not that.
Now
That
you get the gotcha. Yeah.
and we all know the book I'm talking about. There's another book that was more like that came out
Yeah.
of mine. I think with mine, you know, I tried to take uh, a reasonably balanced look. What I didn't do was anytime I described something not so great that Stan did or said, I didn't put neon arrows and dramatic music pointing to it. I just kind of said, here's what he did. And some people think maybe it wasn't the nicest thing he could have done, you know. So and I think what I bring to the book that I bring to all my books about, especially those about comics, is I know how the sausages are made in comics. I kind of
Yeah.
because for me, writing the book about Stan is called A Marvelous Life, The Amazing Story of Stan Lee. Um, and I feel like I bring an understanding of how comics are made and an interpretation of decisions he did and didn't make that even the best biographers or cultural critics can't bring to it because they don't have that experience. And if you've been enjoying my dulcet tones for this past 25 minutes, I also did the audiobook as I've done on all my
Ooh,
books. So
that
if
would work for me
you
because
like
I'm out.
this,
Yeah.
imagine 14 hours of this in your headphones.
That
Listen,
sounds great. Or on the speaker in my office. I might have to check that out.
Hey, Secret Friends Unite, let me tell you about Zencaster. We use them for our show, and now they're supporting us. Zencaster is now the all in one solution making podcasting easy. It's the ultimate web based podcasting solution, provides high quality audio and video podcast production and hosting. With a full suite of professional tools, podcasters can seamlessly record, produce, and publish studio quality content all from one dashboard. Being a creator has never been easier. And we chose Zencaster because of the ease of use, high quality output, and it makes it super easy for our guests to come on. We had multiple solutions we tried before, and Zencaster has just been the best fit for us. Why Zencaster? It's now super easy to record a podcast with Zencaster. Log in using your browser and start recording a high quality podcast right away. Record studio quality sounds and up to 4K video with your guests. Feel a sense of Zen knowing Zencaster's multi layered backups ensure you always have your recordings in the highest quality, even if the connection is unstable. Have you ever worried what you sound like? Zencaster's post production process makes you sound buttery smooth. It automatically removes those ums and ahs in your recording. It removes those awkward pauses in conversation too. Set the right podcast loudness and levels while reducing background noise with a click of a button. So, if you're interested in making an easy, high quality podcast just with the click of a browser button, go to zencaster.com/pricing and use my code SFU1. You'll get 30% off your first month of any Zencaster paid plan. I want you to have the same easy experiences I do for all my podcasting and content needs. It's time to share your story. Now back to the show.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Let me dance backwards a little bit here because I want to talk about Spider-Man. Can't help it. I told you I was a Spider fan since 1986. I was 10. It was
Okay.
issue two. It was issue 278. It was the Let There Be Justice. It's the Hobgoblin Flash Thompson Scourge of the Underworld issue, if it rings a bell. Um, but you were talking about a little bit. You were the group editor for a long time. All these different titles turned into big blow up crossovers. Talk to me like I'm a fourth grader. What does a group editor do? What do they coordinate? What's the job?
Well, okay. So the Spider-Man starts out in 1962. I mean, he debuts in something called Amazing Adult
Yep.
Fantasy, which sounds a lot more sinister these days
Big time. Yeah.
than it does. Actually, the idea then was that it was sort of flattering children to make them think that they were more sophisticated than they were. So, Amazing Adult Fantasy.
Right.
And then he gets his full debut, I think 6 months later, in something called Amazing Spider, number one. And and so that's it. So Spider Man, you like Spider Man, you buy it every month. You buy Amazing Spider Man. Um, but there was an audience who wanted more than that, both overseas in licensed editions and in foreign languages, and in America. So they kind of, I think there was Marvel Team Up, which in effect became a second Spidey book. It was Spider Man teaming up with a different hero
Right.
every issue.
Loved it.
And then I think in the like early, I guess in the mid late 70s,
Yeah. If
late
you're thinking
70s,
of,
there
yeah.
was just the second Spider-Man title, and that was
Yep.
called. I think the conceit was that it would focus more on Peter Parker and less on Spider-Man, but I think that was forgotten by issue two. It was,
Right.
but it was called Peter Parker: The Spectacular Spider-Man,
Right.
and so from there on, there were three monthly Spider-Man titles, and even that, and it wasn't until actually when Tom DeFalco came on staff as an editor in like 1980, I think, that even that the all this at that point the three Spider-Man titles had three different editors.
Oh, jeez. No
Nobody even
connection.
thought, oh gee, maybe one person should be supervising, like at DC, like Mort Weisinger had almost all the Superman titles or whatever back in the 50s and 60s. So Tom had that. Then Tom got promoted to be executive editor, and I was promoted. And even then, it was just still called editor. And that's and so there'd be Spider-Man, Amazing Spider-Man, Marvel Team Up. Then Marvel Team Up changed its title to Web of Spider-Man, so that they could get so that they didn't have to have the gimmick of a different guest star every issue. And even that, and then there'd be the occasional miniseries. Maybe the Black Cat would get a miniseries, or there'd be some. But it wasn't until then I went off. Then I went off staff. I became a freelance editor and writer, and I came back in '89. And even then, well, what happened was in the late '80s there was this big boom or glut, one might even say, in the comics business, and suddenly there seemed no limit to what the market could bear. So suddenly there was Amazing Spectacular Web. Meanwhile, uh, Todd McFarlane had started a fourth monthly title.
Right.
That was called
Spider-Man.
Spider-Man, but of course, in the office, we called it, I guess because we needed to have a modifier, we called it the adjectiveless Spider-Man.
It's too long. Couldn't fit on the marquee.
Right? So that, and then as the pressure grew to put out more and more Spider-Man related titles, suddenly there was my own Deadly Foes of Spider-Man. There was the Black Cat. Got every character um, who had the slightest potential to have a miniseries had a miniseries. So the character named Annex that was created by
Right.
Maxie Harris and Tom Lyle. And I mean, there were just all sorts of miniseries and graphic novels, and so it became this universe within the Marvel universe, and so it was more than one editor could handle. And so I think in the very early '90s, the group editor system was developed. So Bob Harris was the group editor of the X-Men. I was the group editor of Spider-Man. Mark Grunwald had the Avengers group. And there were two or three other groups, and we were all put. It was just this incredible boom time in comics, and so at its peak, the Spider-Man line was putting out about 17 or 18 titles a month. So I remember there were two or three other editors who I supervised, and a couple of assistants, and so I was called the group editor. That was that sort of meant that I was in charge of the whole shebang, and then I reported, to Grunewald and DeFalco, who were hierarchically
Right.
above me. So that's what a group editor. Uh,
Gosh, they just kind of make sure that the titles speak to each other in some fashion.
well, they speak to each other, you know, um, and then it's sort of this, the decisions would be made. Say, if there are four core Spider-Man titles, are they just one long story, or are they four titles that occasionally interact? And either way, who gets which supporting characters? Um, so those are kind of decisions you make depending on the storyline, depending on the market, with the perception of the marketplace. That whole period was also when the Image guys went off to form their own company.
Right, right,
So in a way, it was almost it was exciting in the sense that it was competitive and there seemed to be enough for everybody. When the Image guys left, I think Marvel Comics still kept selling and still went up in sales.
right,
It just seemed to be it was an illusion, but it did seem to be this endless um, marketplace where people who wanted this stuff just seemed there just seemed to be this audience of stuff. People would buy copies, one copy to read, one copy to put away, to beg and board, and one copy for grandma. I don't know what one copy for junior's college education. It was a
right,
weird. It seemed for a period um, this amazing ride. So there was this, you know, there was all this pressure, but it was kind of fun pressure because the writers, the artists, and even the editors were in. We had what we call royalties or incentives. So even though it was a teeny tiny piece of the cover price of each issue, if you sold a million copies of something, that could add up pretty nicely.
right. The commission.
Yeah.
It's like a sales thing. Yeah.
Yeah, we called them either royalties or incentives. I mean, we
Right.
called them royalties but I think maybe legally they had to call them incentives. It
Oh,
was,
gotcha.
yeah.
Always some weird little wrinkle. So, uh, all right. Well, last question. I'll steer away from Spider-Man, believe it or not. But you're a teaching professional. You have taught comics. You're a comic historian, NYU, several other institutions, all over. At what point did that come into effect? Is that something that you're still doing, or
Came into effect. Um, came into effect as people. I had a lot of knowledge, right? I'd kind of accumulated all this weird esoteric knowledge, and there did seem a point. People, people, people would say to me, yeah. I guess I was looking for other revenue streams, right? I mean, it's sort of because I've been essentially a freelancer for the past 25 years. I've had a lot of different staff jobs, and I want to plug one or two other things though before we end
oh,
it,
absolutely.
and it ties into this. So I've become a professional expert, and part of being a professional expert is teaching. Um, Not that teaching pays well. Teaching actually pays terribly, even at prestigious institutions.
So I've heard. So I've heard.
As an adjunct, I mean, look, if I had a doctorate, and whatever, and had started an academic career, in my 20s instead of going to Marvel, maybe, that might be a different story. So I enjoyed teaching. I did enjoy passing it on. I met a lot of creative, bright people, and you know, but what it's funny, people would say to me, where the money is in teaching is if you can take on students as private clients. If somebody, if you find somebody who's talented and enthusiastic, then you can sort of say to them, hey, for the same money you're paying, University X, pay me, and either put one on one or maybe a handful of us will just meet. You pay me all the money and you'll get, a much richer experience. And it's true, it's not a lie.
Hmm. Hmm.
But I have to say, I never found myself entrepreneurial enough to do that, and I always felt a little funny trying to hustle my ex students, even though the times I did it, they seemed to get a lot out of it. It wasn't like, but
Yeah.
just felt weird to me to be going, hey, psst, come here, let me tell you if you like this,
Yeah. Want to buy a watch? Yeah. Kind
right?
of. No, you got to do what you're comfortable with. I get that. So if
And
it felt weird, yeah.
and then for a while, I ran the education department at the old Museum of Comic and Cartoon Art in New York, which then ended up merging with Society of Illustrators. So I did enjoy teaching, but um, once I got some momentum, and then with writing books, so the Stan book did well. Then of course COVID came in and blew everything apart, in both good and bad ways. In terms of teaching, I found myself teaching a lot and lecturing a lot online and doing,
Hmm.
you know, um, being a guest at conventions like in Europe, just because it was easy to do it this way. I'd say right now I wouldn't mind getting back to teaching. What I'm trying to do and am doing is every field of popular culture, as I've learned, no matter how off the beaten track it may seem, has somebody who's a comics fan and knows my work. And
Yeah.
so through that, I mean, then you have to have the goods, but through that, I've become um, a more general pop culture, dare I say, expert. I'm sort of learning while I earn. So I have found myself uh, in 2 years ago and coming up again this summer, I will be speaking at the Bob Dylan conference in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And,
Wow.
and of course, I spoke on Dylan and comics. And then because something else I've done is I've written a book about Jack Ruby, not Jack Kirby.
Right. Right.
Ruby,
Right. Right.
the guy. Well, let me see if I just happen to have a copy of the book. I
By
want
all
to
means.
now this is called Jack Ruby: The Many Faces of Oswald's Assassin. And it actually had started out as a graphic novel project that I was going to do with a guy named Rick Geary, who you may know from National
Hmm.
Lampoon and many other
Hmm.
wonderful artists. And it may still happen, but after I'd written my other nonfiction prose books, my agent was able to sell this to Chicago Review Press, and then I really had to do a lot. but I mean, there are more connections between Jack Ruby. Jack Kirby actually drew a Jack Ruby story in Esquire magazine in
Oh wow.
1967.
Oh my gosh.
Um, so I've so I'm now, and then because of my interest in the Marx Brothers, I spoke at I gave a couple of talks at a recent Marx Brothers Marx Fest in Coney Island in Manhattan,
Oh my gosh.
and then I'm now I'm one thing I have to say about the Jack Ruby book, which I think is, you know I think it's very interesting. I'm not a conspiracy guy, but but I'm also not a straight through Warren Commission guy. So, and Ruby had this very interesting life. He was almost a comic book character. Ruby is a guy who would say to people, "I'm a character, ain't I? I'm eccentric, aren't I a weird character?" I mean, he he was a showbiz. There's the walls between like comics and showbiz and movies and stage. You
Yeah.
Um, and so I took all this research, and then I did a ton more on Ruby. I had access, and I do a lot of stuff about Jewish American history and popular culture, especially related to popular culture. So maybe the apotheosis of that, if I'm using that word right, is I'm
Maybe.
on the phone speaking. All right, I'm on the phone speaking to a guy named Hillel Silverman, who's the father of an actor named Jonathan Silverman from a movie called Weekend at Bernie's.
Absolutely.
Hillel Silverman was Jack Ruby's rabbi in
Oh
Dallas.
oh my
I'm on the
goodness.
phone with Hillel Silverman, who at that he just died like 2 years ago at age 99. Still with all his marbles. Hillel Silverman says to me at that point, "I'm 89 years old. I can barely see. I'm not writing my book about the Ruby trial anymore. Everybody in the Ruby trial was a circus trial like the Chicago 7 trial.
Yeah.
I'm not writing my book about the trial anymore. Would you like my notes from when I visited Jack in prison every other day for 4 months?"
Oh my
I
gosh.
said, "Yeah,
Okay.
I wouldn't mind."
Oh my gosh. Yeah, if it's not too much trouble.
Well,
Oh my gosh.
so they show up, and you say to yourself, "Is it a good idea for me to have original documents relating to the Kennedy assassination in my house?" But anyway, I'm not smart enough to figure out to solve the mysteries of the Kennedy assassination, but I thought I could paint a picture of this really weird guy, Jack Ruby,
Yeah.
and through the pop culture connections, as Jack Kirby draws a story about Jack Ruby, Jack Ruby's rabbi's son is the star of Weekend. There's like all the Jack Ruby, the last guy to give Hank Williams Sr. regular work because he owned country western clubs as well as strip
My
clubs. So I mean, and anyway, so right now I'm in the process. While I will always love comics, and obviously it's my bread and butter, and it's what I'm best known for. I just figure, I'm expanding, my palette of stuff I do. Although it always comes down to somebody in an organization knows my work from comics, which is fine. But
Right.
the thing that I'm, you know, here's a couple of weird stories.
Fire
Hey,
away.
nobody has said to me, I was speaking about, it ties in, right? I'm giving a talk at the Dallas Jewish Historical Society, um, an event co-sponsored by the Dallas Jewish Historical Society and the Sixth Floor Museum, which is the former book depository. Nobody has said to me, you know, you don't, you have no right to write about history or about Jack Ruby. So I mean, the book, unless they're just being polite, no actual lifetime historians have said to me, "How dare you?" or "You got this all wrong." But so I'm very pleased about, especially in Dallas. I just figured, oh my God, if anybody would know if I got it wrong. So I'm in this room in Dallas talking to and everybody there looks familiar because they're all old Jews whose families, whose parents and aunts and uncles knew Jack Ruby.
Mhm. Oh my
Jack Ruby
gosh.
was a champion networker and schmoozer. He knew everybody, and one guy looks particularly familiar, but I didn't think much of it. And meanwhile, I'm telling a story. Do you remember Gilbert Gottfried had a podcast?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And with Frank Santopadre. So Gilbert had Gabe Kaplan on one night from Welcome Back, Kotter.
My god.
And Kaplan tells a story about auditioning for Jack Ruby. It's an incredible story. And you know, in my presentation, I always use a PowerPoint when I'm giving a talk. I have a picture of Gabe Kaplan from the Welcome Back Kotter days, and I'm telling the story, and I'm careful to give it credit. This is a story Gabe Kaplan told on Gilbert and Frank Francis and the Padre story. I go to sit down to sign books, and this guy who looked familiar comes up, and I say, "Who should I make it out to?" He says, "Make it out to Gabe." I go, then the light bulb goes on. I go, "Let me get this straight. You're Gabriel Kaplan, and you were sitting in the audience while I told your story and showed your picture." He goes, "That's right."
How did I do?
And you paid full retail price for a book. So he and so because of that, I mean, I become friendly with him. Not claiming I'm his best buddy, but we're
Yeah.
friendly. And he gave me a blurb for the paperback.
Oh, wow.
But that he lives part time for various reasons in Dallas. Like if I was in New York or LA giving that talk, it's New York or LA, so maybe a celebrity will show up. I did
Sure.
not expect the star of Welcome Back Kotter, who has spent the past 40 years as a professional poker player, you know, but then from there, so Gabe Kaplan, among other things, he knew Groucho Marx, um, and he spent some time in a one-man show being Groucho. So I'm doing the Marx Brothers Festival, and I said, "Yeah, I wonder if I can get Gabe Kaplan to come and do an interview about Groucho for the Marx." And we did this. It was Zoom. He was in L.A. and I was, or wherever he was home, and I was in Tony. So all these things come together, and a lot of it has to do with this. So it's this ongoing post Marvel odyssey where
Yeah.
Marvel and Stan Lee gets my foot in the door places, but then I get to do all this really cool stuff. Um, so it's kind of knock wood. It's an amazing ride.
Yeah.
Um,
Wow.
so yeah, it's just been interesting, and then the other full circle, as I say, is this weekend I'm working this convention. You
Right.
know, I had nothing to do with the content of this book. This is all Larry Lieber. God bless him, Larry. Um, it's a wonderful book, but I mean, I I was just dogged enough to keep pursuing with Matt Selznick and Jesse Simon and Frank Lovett and a bunch of other people to just get. I said to Larry, um, I don't know anything about self-publishing, but I'm going to put a goddamn hardcover copy with a dust jacket of your book in your hand, one way or the other. And we've done that.
Yeah.
And now we're promoting and selling it, and it's available. Well, everything's available on Amazon, but
Right.
uh,
Right. That's fantastic.
and your local, if you prefer to go to your local independent bookstore, then do that. There's chirps.com, chirpsbook.com is
Mm-hmm.
Larry's website, and my website is dannyfingeroth.com. And I guess that's, I don't know if I even answered any question, but
No, you did because you went right all the way through it. My God, I could have just turned the mic on and probably walked away. But I'm glad I didn't. I'm glad I got to sit here and talk
well,
to you.
have a good, you have a very good interviewer face. You have a face that people want to talk to.
Oh my goodness! Holy cow! You could. I'm looking for a joke. Catch a popsicle to a lady with white gloves. You're a salesman. You got it. You definitely got it. Well, that's our time, Danny. This has been absolutely spectacular. I wish I could pop out there and be at that show this weekend. I wish I could go to a lot of shows. I've had a lot of great experiences meeting, those of your ilk at shows, and I've had a lot of great times doing interviews like this. Because of my relationship with my friend Kurt, who introduced you and I. So,
Right.
well, I'm going to wrap us up. Thank you again,
Well,
folks. If you're
thank
listening
you.
to, I'm sorry.
Thank you. This was a great interview. Thank you.
Absolutely. Folks, if you're listening to this on our network feed in the future and you'd like to hear lots of other great interviews like this, patreon.com/Secret Friends Unite. I've been Charlie. This is Danny Fingeroth, and we will see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you.
This podcast is part of the Secret Friends Unite podcasting network, available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and podcast services around the galaxy, as well as video on our YouTube channel. You can support Secret Friends Unite by becoming a Patreon member, get bonus programs and more over at patreon.com/secretfriendsunite. Join our Discord community for even more discussions on all things geek. For all the latest updates on Secret Friends Unite, make sure to follow us on Threads at secret.friends.unite and visit secretfriendsunite.com. Find our merchandise at TeePublic and Redbubble. Thanks for listening, and may the Force live long and prosper.